My therapist of 3 years used my sessions as podcast content. I found out because a friend recommended it, not knowing it was my story. What I did with that information went further than I imagined I could go. There are violations of trust that occur in the spaces you built specifically to be safe. Not on the street, not with strangers. In the office where for 3 years you brought the parts of yourself you brought nowhere else. With the person you told what you had told no one. With the conviction that that space had a specific quality that differentiated it from any other, that what you said there stayed there. That conviction, I learned, was not a guarantee. It was an assumption. And the assumption broke on a Sunday afternoon when a friend sent me a message telling me she had found a very good mental health podcast and that she thought of me when she listened to it and wanted to recommend it to me. What I heard in that podcast was my own story, with details that only one person in the world knew. My name is Andrea. I am 36 years old. I am an architect. I work independently, and 3 years ago, I started a therapeutic process with a psychologist I am going to call Dr. V, because her real identity is part of a process that has not yet fully concluded, and because naming her here is not the point of this story. The point is what happened, what I did, and what I learned about the rights you have within a therapeutic process that many people, myself included, do not know we have. The therapeutic process had begun after a particularly difficult period. The closure of a professional partnership that had also been a personal relationship and that had left me with losses both financial and emotional that I had not known how to process alone. 3 years of honest work. 3 years of bringing the hardest things I had lived to that office. 3 years of trusting. The Sunday of the podcast was an ordinary Sunday. My friend Lucia's message arrived in the afternoon with the enthusiastic tone of someone sharing something they find genuinely valuable. She sent me the link to a specific episode of a psychology and mental health podcast she had found recently. She told me the host talked about relational patterns in people with independent careers and that she had thought of me. I opened it without any particular anticipation. The first 10 minutes were general introduction. Nothing that generated any specific sensation. At minute 11, the host started talking about a clinical case. She said it was a composite and anonymized case. She described a middle-aged woman, an architect, with a grief process around the closure of a professional partnership that had also involved an emotional dimension, with a specific pattern of difficulty distinguishing between professional loss and personal loss, with a tendency to instrumentalize work as an avoidance mechanism for emotional grief. I stopped. I rewound the audio. I listened again. The details that followed in the next 8 minutes of the episode were not generic details that could apply to many people. They were specific details. The type of partnership, the city where it had occurred, the particular dynamic of how the professional and personal had mixed. A specific metaphor I had used in session to describe how I felt the loss, and that the podcast host quoted almost literally as a patient who described this as that metaphor. I had said it in session once, 2 years ago, and it was in a public podcast episode that any person could listen to. I did not finish the episode. I closed the audio. I sat in silence for a time I cannot measure precisely. What I felt was not yet anger. It was something before anger. It was the feeling of having been exposed in a space I had built as the most private of my life, of having brought something vulnerable to a place believing that place was safe and discovering that the person who kept that space had turned it into content. I replied to Lucia that thanks for the recommendation and that I would listen to it calmly. I did not tell her anything more, not because I wanted to hide something from her, but because I needed to understand first what I had found before talking to anyone else about it. The first thing I did was listen to the previous episodes of the podcast. There were 42 episodes published over approximately a year and a half. In 16 of those episodes, there were clinical case segments presented as composite and anonymized. I listened to all 16. In 3 of them, I recognized details that corresponded to things I had said in session. Not all from the same episode. Distributed, as if the host were taking fragments from different sessions and using them in different thematic contexts. In one of the episodes, there was a description of a recurring dream I had recounted in session and that the host used to illustrate a point about grief processing mechanisms. That dream, I had described it with very specific words. And some of those words appeared in the podcast. The podcast host used a pseudonym, but the podcast had a website, and the website had a contact section with a form and an email address. I searched the name of the podcast in combination with terms related to clinical psychology in my city. On the third search, I found a reference in a mental health forum where someone mentioned the podcast and connected it to the real name of its host. The name was Dr. V's. I called my sister that night. My sister is not a psychologist or an attorney. She is the person I talk to when I need to think out loud before I know what I want to do. I told her everything. She listened to the end. Then she asked me how I felt. I told her I did not yet completely know, that there was something that felt like betrayal and something that felt like invasion and something that felt like a retroactive loss of something I had thought I had, and that I now did not know whether I had really had. She told me that sounded like enough to do something with. I told her yes, that I needed to know what I could do. The following day, I called an attorney specializing in health law and data protection that I found through a colleague's recommendation. Her name was Patricia. I described the situation in a 20-minute call. Patricia asked me 3 questions. Whether I had a way to document that the podcast content corresponded to my sessions. Whether I had signed an informed consent at the beginning of the therapeutic process that authorized the use of clinical material for educational or outreach purposes. And whether the podcast was publicly accessible or restricted. I told her yes, I had a way to document it, though it would require work. That I had signed an informed consent at the start of therapy, but did not remember exactly what it said and did not have a copy. That the podcast was completely public and free. Patricia told me the first thing was to obtain a copy of that informed consent. That the informed consent was the central document, because if it did not include explicit authorization for the use of clinical material and public outreach content, then what Dr. V had done had very clear ethical and potentially legal implications. I requested a copy of my informed consent from Dr. V by email. I did not explain why I was requesting it. I told her I needed a copy of my process opening documents for my personal records. She sent it to me within 2 days. The informed consent I had signed at the start of therapy 3 years earlier authorized the use of clinical material in an anonymized way exclusively for clinical supervision between professionals and for academic training in private contexts. It did not mention public outreach content. It did not mention podcasts. It did not mention any format of communication to the general public. Patricia, when she read the document, told me the use Dr. V had made of my clinical material exceeded the terms of the consent I had signed. That this was relevant before the professional board that regulated her practice. That it was also relevant under applicable data protection regulations, even though the material was presented as anonymized, because the specificity of the details reduced the actual level of anonymization to a point that could be challenged. The process that followed had 2 parallel parts. The first was the complaint to the city's board of psychologists. Patricia helped me build the file. The 3 podcast episodes with the specific fragments corresponding to material from my sessions, the informed consent with its explicit limits, and a detailed description of each correspondence between the podcast content and what I remembered having said in session. I could not prove with a recording that I had said those things in that office, but I could demonstrate that the details were specific enough that the probability of them being coincidence was very low, and that the pattern across 3 episodes reinforced that conclusion. The second part was a formal letter to Dr. V, sent by Patricia, notifying her that I had initiated a complaint process with the board and that I expected the podcast to be taken down from public platforms while the process was underway. Dr. V responded through her own attorney. Her initial position was that the material was sufficiently anonymized and composite as to not constitute a confidentiality violation. Patricia responded with the analysis of the specific details and the question of how many architects in this city had lived exactly that combination of circumstances and had used exactly that metaphor in that context. The podcast was taken down from all platforms 3 weeks after that exchange. The process before the board of psychologists lasted 5 months. I am not going to go into the complete details of the resolution because they form part of a process with its own terms. What I can say is that the board determined that there had been a violation of the ethical principles of professional practice related to confidentiality and the scope of the informed consent. Dr. V received a sanction that included a period of mandatory supervision of her practice and the obligation to complete specific training in clinical ethics and data protection in outreach contexts. It was not a sanction that ended her career. It was a sanction that went into her professional record and that established a precedent for how she handles the clinical material of her patients in the future. For me, it was enough. Not because she did not deserve more, but because what I needed was not to destroy a person. It was for what she had done to have real consequences in the only space where those consequences matter for someone who practices a regulated profession. Her professional record. I ended the therapeutic process with Dr. V the same day I sent the complaint to the board. Not with an emotional call. With a brief email informing her I was terminating the process and did not require a closing session. I started with a new therapist 4 months later, with more questions this time before beginning, with an explicit conversation about the informed consent before signing it, with the certainty that asking how clinical material is used is not distrust, but responsibility. What I want you to take from this story has parts that apply to anyone who is in a therapeutic process or who is thinking about starting one. The first, read your informed consent before signing it. It is not a formality. It is the document that defines what your therapist can do with what you say in session. Ask specifically whether the professional uses clinical material in supervision, training, publications, or any type of content. You have the right to that information before starting. The second, if something your therapist says in any public context feels familiar to you in a way it should not, trust that feeling. Document. Seek advice. The third, professional boards exist precisely for these cases. A formal complaint to the board of psychologists or psychiatrists in your city is a real mechanism with real consequences. It is not just bureaucracy. It is the structure that regulates that people who practice professions of trust do so within ethical limits. And the fourth and most important, the therapeutic space is yours, not the therapist's. The material you bring there belongs to you, and you have the right for it to be treated with the same care with which you brought it. If this story impacted you, comment. Did you ever review your informed consent before signing it in therapy? Like if you believe therapists who use patients' clinical material as public content without explicit consent should face real professional consequences. Subscribe for more real stories. Share with someone who is in a therapeutic process or thinking about starting one. Practical tip. Before starting any therapeutic process, ask your therapist directly whether they use patients' clinical material in supervision, publications, podcasts, social media, or any other format. An ethical professional will answer that question with transparency and will explain exactly the limits of how they use that material. If the answer is evasive or if the informed consent is not clear on that point, that is information about how that professional understands confidentiality.